Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's been making the rounds lately.
Okay.
This idea of a new Roaring Twenties.
Hmm.
Like, are we really in a new Roaring Twenties?
Yeah.
And what would
Alright.
that even mean?
Yeah.
What would that even mean for us?
Right.
So we've got this article.
Uh-huh.
It was originally published in Spanish,
Okay.
and it's called "Living the New Roaring Twenties."
Right.
And it's got me thinking,
Yeah.
are the good times really back? Or is this just like a blip?
Right.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
So, what is this article all about?
Well, it starts off with a really fascinating comparison between now and the 1920s.
Oh, interesting.
And it points out that both decades followed global pandemics.
Right, we all remember COVID-19,
Exactly.
obviously, and back then it was the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the pandemics, right? The article goes on to talk about how both eras saw this huge surge in leisure spending.
That's right.
Like people were just ready to party. They were ready to go out and have fun.
Like a collective exhale almost.
Yeah. And it even compares modern music festivals to the jazz clubs of the Roaring Twenties.
That's a really interesting parallel.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Like this need to just let loose,
Exactly.
especially after going through something so difficult.
Yeah. And then the article makes another point that I thought was really interesting.
What's that?
It talks about how a lot of the things we consider essential today, like PVs, washing machines, even clothes,
Mm.
are actually more affordable now than they were back in the 1920s.
That's true.
And it's because of things like globalization
Huh?
and efficient manufacturing.
Yeah, it's amazing how much things have changed.
Right. I was actually just shopping online the other day, and it hit me just like how many clothing options there are,
Right.
especially with all those like ultra-fast fashion brands.
It's a completely different world.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. So, okay, we've got people spending money on leisure. We've got goods that are more affordable.
Yeah.
But what about like the bigger economic picture?
So the article highlights some positive indicators.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, low unemployment.
Okay.
Also, global economic growth is pretty strong,
Uh-huh.
and there's even been a slight decrease in inequality.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's partly due to rising minimum wages.
So some positive signs for sure.
Yeah,
But let's be real. The article doesn't completely ignore the challenges either.
of course not.
I mean, we're all dealing with inflation,
Right.
and the housing crisis is a huge issue.
Yeah, those are serious concerns.
So does the article address those at all?
It does, actually, and it offers a little glimmer of hope.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it points out that inflation is actually starting to decline.
Oh, that's good.
And on the housing front,
Yeah.
some governments are starting to take steps to tackle affordability.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they're looking at things like increasing social housing options
Uh-huh.
and trying to find ways to balance those short-term tourist rentals
Right.
with long-term rentals for residents.
That makes sense. Okay, so maybe it's not all dim and gloom,
Hmm.
but there's this one thing in the article that I have to ask about.
Oh, what's that?
Donald Trump.
Hmm.
It mentions him coming back into power
Yeah,
and how that could really shake things up.
right.
So what's the article's take on his potential impact on this new Roaring Twenties idea?
Well, it's definitely a wild card.
Yeah.
But the article suggests that in the short term, Trump's policies could actually boost economic activity.
How so?
Well, he tends to favor deregulation and tax cuts,
Right.
and that could potentially extend the current expansion.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I also can't help but wonder, what's the potential downside? Knowing Trump,
Yeah.
there's got to be some risk involved.
The article does mention some risks.
Okay, like what?
It says that his policies, which are kind of a mix of anarcho-capitalism and crony capitalism,
Okay.
could actually make an economic crash more likely.
Wow.
Similar to what happened after the original Roaring
Is
Twenties.
this a gamble then?
It seems that way.
Potential for a boost, but also a big risk of a downturn. Is there anything else the article points to that could cause a crash?
Oh, one factor it highlights is all the hype around artificial intelligence.
Oh, AI.
There's so much money pouring into AI right now.
Right, driving up stock prices.
Exactly.
But what if AI doesn't live up to all the hype?
That's the question. It could lead to a burst bubble and a big market correction.
So we've got this potential for boom and bust. It's a lot to think about, but I'm curious. The article doesn't just focus on the economics, right?
Right.
It also compares like the social and political landscapes of the two eras.
That's a crucial part of comparison.
Okay, so what does it say about that?
Well, one surprising point it makes is that despite all the challenges we face today,
Yeah.
the new Roaring Twenties might actually be better than the original in some way.
Really? Better? How so?
It points out that inequality and poverty were far more severe in the 1920s.
That's true.
And the political landscape back then was incredibly volatile.
Right, with the rise of fascism and communism.
That's-
Those were some scary times for democracy.
Absolutely.
Like Mussolini and Stalin.
Those were dark days.
Yeah, those names send chills down my spine. So the article's saying that even though we have threats to democracy today, they're not as bad as those totalitarian regimes.
Right, at least not yet.
So the new Roaring Twenties, for all its uncertainties, might be a less tumultuous time.
It's an interesting perspective.
It is. But it also makes you wonder, did everyone benefit equally from the economic boom of the original Roaring Twenties?
That's a really important question.
And are we at risk of repeating that pattern today?
That's something we need to consider as we continue this deep dive.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about. So we've covered the economic parallels, the potential for boom and bust, and even touched on the social and political context. But the core question still remains.
What's that?
Are we really in a new Roaring Twenties? Or is this just a temporary high?
That is the million-dollar question. Well, the article doesn't give us a straight answer, but it does make you think. Like, who might end up paying the price for all this economic growth?
That's a good question.
And what are the long-term impacts?
Yeah.
Those are things worth pondering.
Definitely makes you wonder if this new Roaring Twenties is built to last, or if it's all going to come crashing down.
Exactly.
But going back to those parallels for a second, one thing that stood out to me was the article's point about leisure activities.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like people are just as eager to enjoy themselves now as they were back then.
You're absolutely right. The article highlights this parallel between those packed jazz clubs of the 1920s and today's massive music festivals.
Right.
It's like this timeless desire for shared experiences and just pure entertainment.
Yeah, it's like we need that,
Yeah.
especially after tough times.
Yeah.
And it's not just music festivals, right? Like, I've noticed that concerts in general seem to be more popular than ever.
That's true.
Is there a reason for that, besides people just wanting to have fun?
Well, the article suggests there's an economic angle, too.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, with digital platforms taking a bite out of music sales, artists are relying more and more on live performances.
Right, to make money.
Exactly.
So it's like this perfect storm. Our desire for experiences combines with the industry's need to make a profit.
Makes sense.
Speaking of booming industries, though, the article also touched on tourism. It seems like travel is having its own roaring moment.
Absolutely. Travel is booming right now. The article highlights how tourism in developed countries has already bounced back to pre-pandemic levels, and in some cases even surpassed them.
Wow.
It specifically mentions Spain as a prime example,
Really?
predicting it could soon become the world's top tourist destination.
Spain, huh? That's interesting.
It is.
What is it about Spain that's drawing so many tourists?
Well, according to the article, Spain seems to be hitting all the right notes for modern travelers. It mentions a ranking from the United States News and World Report
Okay.
that puts Spain at the top of the list for most fun country.
Most fun country.
Yeah, pretty impressive, right?
That's a pretty cool title.
Yeah.
What makes a country fun, though, according to this ranking?
Well, the article points to Spain's vibrant and accessible culture,
Okay.
especially the exuberance and quality of its folk traditions.
Like what?
Think flamenco dancing, the excitement of festivals like La Tomatina, and of course the iconic running of the bulls in Pamplona.
Yeah, Spain is definitely known for those kinds of lively experiences.
It is.
But beyond the culture,
Yeah.
what else makes Spain so appealing?
Well, you can't forget about the food.
Right.
The article highlights Spain's culinary delights.
Oh, yeah, the food is amazing there.
From tapas and paella to sangria, it's a major draw for visitors.
Makes sense.
It even mentions this specific example from Seville,
Okay.
where they combined traditional Holy Week processions
Uh-huh.
with Christmas lights last December.
Wow, talk about a unique fusion. That
Yeah.
sounds incredible. It definitely seems like Spain is taking advantage of this new Roaring Twenties energy.
They're definitely capitalizing on it.
But shifting gears for a bit, the article also made a point about how much more affordable durable goods are today
Right.
compared to the 1920s. It's mind-boggling to think that things like refrigerators and washing machines used to be major purchases. That often put people into debt.
It's crazy how times have changed.
Yeah, thanks to global manufacturing and efficient supply chains, those goods are relatively inexpensive now, at least compared to wages.
And as I mentioned earlier,
Oh.
even clothing has become much more accessible.
Right, especially with those ultra-low-cost fashion platforms. It's
Exactly.
like we're living in an age of abundance, at least when it comes to material goods. But there's always a flip side.
Right.
What are some of the downsides the article mentions in relation to these trends?
Well, the article raises concerns about the environmental impact
Oh,
of fast fashion
that's a big one.
and the potential for exploitation within those global supply chains.
Yeah.
It also cautions against excessive consumerism, like rising personal debt
Right.
and widening economic inequality.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
In a way.
Plenty of stuff, but at what cost?
Exactly.
So we're seeing these parallels to the Roaring Twenties, both good and bad. What does that tell us about where we might be headed?
Well, the article dives into some specific economic factors.
Okay, like what?
Things like record high stock valuations
Ah.
and the rise of cryptocurrency.
Right.
It suggests that these trends, coupled with those low unemployment rates, are fueling this sense of optimism
Yeah.
and driving up consumer spending.
Okay, I can see that.
But then it throws in a potential wild card,
Oh, what's that?
the return of Donald Trump.
The Trump card?
Right.
How does the article see his potential return impacting this new Roaring Twenties scenario?
Well, it suggests that his policies, with their emphasis on deregulation and tax cuts, could actually extend the current economic expansion.
But as we discussed earlier, there's also that risk of a crash, especially with his unpredictable approach.
Right.
Does the article elaborate on that risk?
It does, and it gets pretty specific.
Okay, tell me more.
It suggests that Trump's policies, which it describes as this blend of anarcho-capitalism and crony capitalism,
Interesting.
could actually make a sudden financial crash more likely.
So a high-risk, high-reward situation.
Yeah, you could say that.
What other factors does the article point to as potential contributors to a crash?
One major one is the speculative bubble around artificial intelligence.
Oh, AI again.
Yeah, all that investment pouring into AI is driving up stock valuations.
Right.
But if those advancements don't deliver, that bubble could burst, leading to a significant market correction.
So this potential economic roller coaster makes you think twice about celebrating too early.
It does.
But I'm also curious about those social and political comparisons the article makes. We touched on it before, but I want to dig a little deeper.
Okay, let's do that.
The article makes this surprising argument
What's that?
that despite all the challenges we face today, the new Roaring Twenties might actually be better than the original in some ways.
Better. Yeah. And what's...
I know, right?
Yeah.
Weren't the 1920s a time of great social and cultural change?
They were. But the article points out that inequality and poverty were far more severe back then.
Okay, true.
And the political landscape was incredibly unstable with the rise of dangerous ideologies.
Like what?
Like fascism and communism.
Yeah, that led to those totalitarian regimes that threatened democracies worldwide. We're talking about the rise of figures like Mussolini and Stalin, who really cast a dark shadow over the 20th century.
A very dark shadow.
It's a sobering reminder of just how volatile that era was.
It was a truly turbulent time.
But are things really that much better today? I mean, we have our own set of challenges, right?
We do.
Political polarization, concerns about democratic backsliding.
Those are real concerns.
It's not exactly a walk in the park.
No, it's not.
But the article argues that, at least for now, those threats are not as acute as those totalitarian regimes that emerged in the 1920s.
That's what the article suggests.
So while we're not out of the woods yet, we might be in a better position to navigate these challenges.
It's possible.
But I'm curious. The article mentioned that the good times weren't enjoyed equally by everyone. In the original Roaring Twenties,
Right.
is there a similar concern with our current new Roaring Twenties?
That's a crucial point. The article highlights that a smaller percentage of the population actually benefited from the economic boom back then, largely due to those high levels of inequality and poverty. And it raises the question, are we repeating that pattern today? Are the benefits of this supposed boom being distributed fairly? Or are we seeing a widening gap between the haves and have-nots?
That's a question we definitely need to grapple with.
It is.
As we continue this deep dive. But before we get too caught up in the big picture, I want to zoom in on some of the details.
Okay.
The article provides about the economic factors at play.
That's a good idea.
I'm particularly interested in what it has to say about global economic forces. After all, we're not just talking about isolated national trends. This is a global phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And the article delves into some interesting global trends,
It does.
particularly highlighting Germany's current economic struggles.
Oh, yeah. Germany.
It even refers to Germany as the sick man of Europe.
Sick man of Europe.
That sounds familiar. Didn't Germany face a similar label back in the early 2000s?
They did.
What's causing their economic woes this time around?
Well, it's a different set of challenges.
Okay.
The article points out that Germany is actually in a unique situation
Well,
compared to other developed nations.
how so?
Well, while many countries are enjoying economic growth, Germany is lagging behind.
So they're not exactly having a roaring 20s of their own.
Not quite.
What factors are contributing to their economic slowdown?
The article suggests that Germany's economic model, which relies heavily on exports,
Right.
might be facing some headwinds
Yep.
in the current global landscape.
Makes sense. With global trade tensions
Mm-hmm.
and shifting economic powers,
Yeah.
it's bound to have an impact on export-oriented economies.
It's a ripple effect.
Yeah. So even in a period of overall global growth, there are always winners and losers.
That's the reality of the global economy.
And some economies might get left behind.
Unfortunately, yes.
But setting Germany's situation aside for a moment, the article seems to suggest that overall, the global economy is in a pretty good place right now.
That's the general sentiment. But the article doesn't shy away from pointing out that there are still some significant global challenges that could potentially derail this new Roaring Twenties narrative.
Oh, like what?
It specifically mentions inflation
That's a big one.
and the increasing difficulty many people face in accessing affordable housing.
Right, those are issues that hit close to home for a lot of people.
They do.
We're all feeling the pinch at the grocery store. And finding a decent place to live is becoming increasingly difficult.
Especially in major cities.
Yeah. Does the article offer any solutions or reasons for optimism on these fronts?
Actually, it does.
Oh, okay.
And this is where things get interesting.
Tell me more.
The article suggests there are signs of hope on both the inflation and housing fronts.
I like the sound of that.
It points out that inflation is actually beginning to decline.
Okay. That's encouraging.
And on the housing front,
Yeah?
it highlights that some governments are starting to take action
That's good.
to address the affordability crisis.
What kind of actions are they taking? Are there any specific examples the article mentions?
It specifically highlights Spain as an example.
Oh, Spain.
It points out that both left-leaning and right-leaning administrations in Spain are recognizing the severity of the housing situation and are taking steps to increase the availability of social housing.
Oh, that's a good start.
They're also trying to create more balance between the profitability of short-term tourist rentals and long-term rentals.
So making long-term renting more appealing?
Exactly.
That sounds like a smart approach.
It does.
But the article also draws a contrast to the original Roaring Twenties. When it comes to housing, right?
yes.
It notes that access to housing wasn't as much of a challenge back then.
That's right.
Cities were able to build more easily and quickly to meet growing demand, which kept housing prices relatively stable.
And in some countries, housing prices actually reached historic lows in the early 1920s.
So what changed? Why is housing such a hot-button issue now, even during a time of supposed economic prosperity?
Well, the article points to several factors.
Okay, it's like what?
Things like increased urbanization,
Yeah.
more complex bureaucratic processes,
Right.
and stricter environmental regulations.
Those all make sense.
All of these things contribute to the challenges of building new housing, especially affordable housing, to meet the growing demand.
It's like progress creating new challenges.
In a way, yes.
We've made strides in areas like environmental protection and urban planning, but those advancements have also made it harder to address the need for affordable housing.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah, a delicate one for sure. So we've got this mix of economic indicators: global growth, Germany's struggles, inflation concerns, the housing crisis, and the potential impact of government policies.
It's a complex picture.
It is. It's a lot to take in. But ultimately, the question remains, are we truly living in a new Roaring Twenties?
That is the big question. And the article doesn't offer a definitive answer. Instead, it encourages us to consider the complexities, to look beyond the headlines and hype, and to think critically about the potential consequences of our actions.
It's like history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but
Yeah.
it often rhymes.
That's a good way to put it.
We can learn from the past, both its triumphs and mistakes, to try to shape a better future.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from our deep dive into the new Roaring Twenties.
I think you're right.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the new Roaring Twenties. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking exploration.
It has.
And we hope you've enjoyed the dive. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. It's interesting how the article really zooms in on Germany,
Yeah.
as this sort of case study. They call it the sick man of Europe.
Right.
which is a pretty strong statement.
It is.
What exactly is going on with their economy?
Right.
And why is it lagging behind the rest of the developed world?
The article points out that Germany's situation is kind of unique, actually.
Okay.
Many countries are seeing this strong economic growth,
Right.
but Germany's experiencing a slowdown.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because this isn't the first time that Germany's been labeled the sick man of Europe.
Right. I remember that.
They faced a similar situation back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, but the reasons were different then, weren't they?
Exactly.
So what's contributing to their economic woes this time? The article mentioned their reliance on exports, but is there more to it than that?
It does suggest that Germany's export-oriented economic model might be struggling in this current global landscape.
In what way?
Think about all the trade tensions and the
Okay.
shifting economic powers. It creates a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
And for a country like Germany, that relies so heavily on exports.
Yeah.
It's bound to have an impact.
Makes sense. I mean, when your economy is so dependent on global trade, you're vulnerable to those kinds of shifts.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that even in a time of overall global growth, there are always winners and losers.
That's the reality, unfortunately.
And some economies might get left behind.
It happens.
But setting Germany's situation aside for a moment, the article seems to suggest that overall, the global economy is in a pretty good place
Yeah, that's the general feeling.
right now.
But it does point out that there are still some significant global challenges
Okay, like what?
that could threaten this whole new Roaring Twenties narrative.
Shares.
Well, it specifically mentions inflation
Yeah.
and the difficulty many people are having
Yeah.
finding affordable housing.
Right. Those are issues that people are feeling all over the world.
Exactly. It's not just a local problem.
We're all feeling the impact of rising prices. And finding a decent place to live is getting harder and harder.
Especially in those big cities.
Yeah. Does the article offer any insights into how those issues might be addressed?
It does, and this is where things get interesting.
Okay.
It suggests there are signs of hope
Oh, good.
for both inflation and the housing crisis.
I was hoping you'd say that.
It points out that inflation is actually starting to go down.
Okay, well, that's encouraging.
And on the housing front,
Yeah.
some governments are starting to take action
Oh, that's good to hear.
to address the affordability crisis.
What kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, it specifically highlights Spain.
Spain again?
Yeah, it seems like they're doing some interesting things.
So what are they doing?
They're increasing the availability of social housing,
Okay.
and they're trying to create a more balanced rental market
In what way?
by addressing the dominance of those short-term tourist rentals.
So trying to make long-term renting more appealing.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But it also makes you wonder why housing has become such a problem now compared to the original Roaring Twenties.
Right, the article mentioned that. Housing wasn't as much of a challenge back then.
Right, they were able to build more easily and quickly
Exactly.
to meet the demand, which kept prices relatively stable.
And in some places, prices actually hit record lows in the early 1920s.
So what happened? Why is it so much harder to build affordable housing these days?
Well, the article points to a few factors.
Okay.
Increased urbanization, more complex bureaucratic processes for construction,
Makes sense.
stricter environmental regulations.
Right. Those all play a role.
It's all part of the challenge.
It's like progress creating new challenges.
In a way, yeah.
We've made progress in areas like environmental protection and urban planning, but those advancements have also made it harder to address the need for affordable housing.
It's a trade-off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a tough one. So we've got this mix of global economic growth, but not everyone is benefiting equally. Germany's struggles show how vulnerable some economies are. And then we've got inflation and the housing crisis affecting people worldwide.
It's a complex picture.
It is. It's a lot to unpack. And the article doesn't give us any easy answers.
It doesn't, but that's okay.
Right? It encourages us to think critically
To look beyond those headlines.
and really consider the consequences.
Right, there are choices.
Like, history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes.
That's a good way to put it.
We can learn from the past, both the good and the bad,
Yeah,
to try and create a better future.
absolutely.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from all of this.
To be mindful of the lessons history teaches us,
Yeah, to learn from the Roaring Twenties, both the original and the potential new one.
so we don't repeat the mistakes.
Exactly.
And maybe we can create a better roar this time
A
around.
more equitable and sustainable one.
I like that.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. And as always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.